Good evening and welcome once again to A Closer Look. I'm Belva Davis. Tonight we'll report on some of the background behind the People's Temple, including the political influence of the Reverend Jim Jones and the ongoing investigation into that cult. We'll also have a report from Phil Bronstein about events today at the San Francisco Temple. In our studio we have a number of guests, including a temple defector, a special investigator from the District Attorney's Office, Assemblyman Willie Brown, and writer Phil Tracy, who has often written extensively about People's Temple, as well as Dr. Carleton Goodlett, Reverend Jim Jones's personal physician. Well, the bodies of at least 409 men, women, and children, some shot to death, most apparently self-poisoned, have been found at the Guyana jungle camp of People's Temple. Among the bodies were those of the temple's fanatical founder, the Reverend Jim Jones, his wife, and at least one of their children. Jones had been shot in the head and was one of the few to die from a bullet wound. All the dead were believed to be Americans, many of them from the Bay Area. Most had reportedly stood in line to take doses of cyanide-laced Kool-Aid from a large tub. The mass deaths apparently occurred about an hour or more after Saturday's ambush, which left Bay Area Congressman Leo Ryan and 4 others dead. Guyana troops swept through the nearby jungle today in search of the remaining 500 to 700 Americans who were at that camp. By dark, they had only located 12 survivors. A special phone number has been set up by the State Department for the families of those in Guyana seeking information about their loved ones. That number is area code 202-632-6610. That's area code 202-632-6610. Here in San Francisco, the mood at the People's Temple has been one of apprehension and waiting. The temple members are waiting inside and a large press group outside. Phil Bronstein has been there for the last 2 days, and Phil now has this report for us.
For the last 2 days, the People's Temple on O'Farrell Street in San Francisco here has been, like the Patty Hearst story, a media event. The crush of reporters, international, national, and local, has been met with virtual silence from the some 25 temple members left at the temple headquarters here. They're guarding the gates a few at a time, and the reporters and cameramen have jumped at every movement, even photographing each other reading the paper. 2 network camera crews, NBC and CBS, had hired private guards to protect them, and some of those reporters had known the NBC men killed in Guyana. The major movement over the last 2 rainy days has been relatives of temple members coming to find out about the welfare of their family members. They talk to the press, curse the temple, and sometimes attack the temple gatesmen in frustration.
I'll show you how great God is. And you guys have to have your henchmen over there shoot out the window on me. Since he's sitting back up there with the gun in the window. You got your gun in the shack, I ain't got a razor blade.
Most of the relatives refused to be photographed. They were worried about possible reprisals against their kin in Guyana. Yesterday, one young man came who had a mother in Guyana and a brother at the temple here.
He was still in high school. They said they was going to learn him a trade, which, you know, heavy equipment here pays a lot. Yeah. He came back, you know, he told me, you know, well, I'll be making more money than you are, as much money as you, you know.
And that wasn't true?
Well, he hasn't, I've gotten 2 letters, and each letter he didn't say anything about heavy equipment.
Only 2 letters in all that time?
Yeah.
What did he say?
Just a bunch of bullshit. I mean, you know, that doesn't even sound like him.
Temple members drove in and out periodically, but early yesterday, a temple spokesman did read a statement saying the temple here deplored the violence in Guyana. At first, the temple spokesman said their shortwave radio communication with Jonestown was down. Later, they said it was working, but that they hadn't had contact since Saturday afternoon. The only real shift in activity came when a package was left at the front of the temple on Geary, and the bomb squad defused what turned out to be some drinking glasses in a box. The only person allowed in initially who wasn't a temple member was Tom Fleming from the black newspaper The Sun Reporter. whose publisher, Carleton Goodlett, has steadfastly supported the temple. But late yesterday, Deputy Police Chief Clem Deamicis took a tour of the temple. He came out after 2 hours to say the 25 temple members were all right, that they were waiting for word from Guyana and didn't know any more than anyone else. We asked him about any local investigations regarding the temple currently underway.
There had been some investigation some time ago, not by the police department, but by other entities. I can't tell you what the conclusion of that investigation or if it has been concluded.
Are there open investigations now underway?
Not in the San Francisco Police Department. Regarding this particular building, we will keep 4 officers here 24 hours a day, as long as it's necessary to protect the safety of the people in that building and the property on this block.
Today, even after the mass suicide reports, it was much the same at the temple. More waiting, more relatives, and a lot of hecklers, reflecting a neighborhood hostility towards the temple we found was pretty widespread. That hostility was there despite the fact that most temple members left, like their neighbors in the Western Addition, are black and working class. This afternoon, the media crowd had swelled even more, if that's possible, and we're told by Deamicis after his second visit that temple members were alive and well, would continue to receive police protection, and were unhappy about the loss of their friends. They're people just like anyone else, Deamicis told the press. Belva?
Over in Berkeley, former members of People's Temple met with the press today under a blanket of tight police security. Nancy Steidtmann reports.
The entourage of press people began early this morning inside this house in Berkeley. Inside, a small group of former members of the People's Temple gathered to discuss their experiences with reporters. They spoke of beatings, tortures, and a fanatical, paranoid leader. They also talked about unconfirmed reports from Guyana. They characterized Jim Jones as a madman, and they waited to learn of his fate. Outside, Berkeley police patrolled the area, a precaution taken by the city because of recent instances of violence and intimidation. Some people inside the house waited for news of relatives in Guyana. Wanda Johnson is a former member of the People's Temple whose son Tommy is among those children feared dead. She agreed to send her son to Guyana 4 years ago. 6 months ago, her husband unsuccessfully tried to rescue the boy from the Jonestown settlement. Al and Jeannie Mills operate the Human Freedom Center where today's gathering was held. Although Mills left the People's Temple in November 1975, he has received a number of threats in the past 3 years. He explains his feelings about the People's Temple.
To leave People's Temple, you had to decide you'd rather die than continue to go there and see the beatings and the mistreatment of people, the rip-off of senior black people from their homes, all their property. You had to decide that you were ready to die when you left the church.
The waiting continued throughout the day as reports of the mass suicides were confirmed. Those waiting here are concerned about their safety, the safety of their families, and what will follow in the aftermath of shootings and mass suicides which occurred this weekend.
The assassination in Guyana has touched off an intense investigation involving a network of law enforcement teams across the country. Pamela Youn reports on the status of that investigation.
Although police authorities in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Mendocino County, and Indianapolis had been previously warned of illegal activities within the People's Temple, those investigations had either been stifled or were proven inconclusive. The FBI, which now leads the inquiry into the Guyana assassinations, is poring over these inactive files and stalemated investigations for clues as to how, why, and possibly who is responsible for allowing the situation to go so far. The FBI is receiving special assistance from law enforcement in Indianapolis, where Jones began his ministry 20 years ago, and Mendocino County, where his church took root. It was there in Ukiah where Jones apparently established a pattern of popularity among political figures. In Los Angeles, a spokesman from the district attorney's office told the LA Times that their 6-month investigation had been deliberately squelched because of Jones's influence among local politicians. The spokesman said his office had received letters from influential people trying to head off the investigation. Jones delivered large blocks of votes, he said. Our investigation went nowhere. In San Francisco, the DA's office had received complaints ranging from child abduction to homicide. A frustrating one-year investigation proved inconclusive. The FBI is now delving into this apparent immunity from prosecution that Jones had miraculously acquired throughout his 20-year career. The FBI is also concerned that Jones's doctrine is still embraced by possibly hundreds of followers. Investigators are determined to learn not only the motivation behind the Guyana massacre, but what to expect from the remaining members of the People's Temple.
Well, aside from being a religious leader, the Reverend Jim Jones also wanted to be a political force in this state. And now, as Rollin Post reports, he was well on his way to achieving that goal. Rollin?
Well, Belva, aside from the Reverend Jim Jones's desire certainly to control and dominate the bodies and the souls of his church members, Jones also understood the value of politics and the advantage of knowing and aiding elected officials. In San Francisco, he became a conspicuous and welcome part of the Democratic Party. One of the many candidates he helped was San Francisco Mayor George Moscone, who in 1976 appointed the Reverend Jones as chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority. Well, today, Mayor Moscone explained Jones's influence on the political life of the city.
I think, first of all, you overrate political influence, but if you mean why Governor Brown would speak at his church, why I would be there, the district attorney, Senator Marks, Dianne Feinstein, all kinds of people, was very simple. Those events were major events. The celebration of the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, and that's where the event was to take place. And those of us were asked to say what we thought Martin Luther King's death meant.
Nobody seemed terribly suspicious about the way he ran the church. And it's a very disciplined, strict operation he had.
There is no question. Not one politician, to my knowledge, who sought and received Mr. Jones's support, Reverend Jones's support, ever questioned the method of his running a church. I don't question the method of running a Catholic church. Many of us don't question the method of running Delancey Street or any of the other organizations that are highly disciplined and that can deliver bodies. Unless there are some allegations presented, and the first allegations ever presented in a negative fashion on People's Temple were presented by an article in New West authored by Mr. Phil Tracy and Mr. Marshall Kildroff. That was the first time anybody ever said anything negative publicly about People's Temple, and at that time the allegation was not one that would have prompted anyone becoming so exasperated as to withdraw their identification.
We have Phil Tracy with us, so we'll be talking about those charges that he wrote about. We thank you very much, Assemblyman Brown, for being with us to at least discuss the political implications of this. We'll be back in just a moment. In our studios tonight to discuss the implications of this dreadful episode, Dr. Carleton Goodlett is the publisher of the San Francisco Sun-Reporter. He was a close friend and the personal physician of Reverend Jones. Al Mills is a former member of People's Temple, now a bitter opponent. He is currently staying at the Human Freedom Center in Berkeley under police protection. Phil Tracy, along with Marshall Kildroff of the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote the first major expose of People's Temple for New West magazine in August of 1977. And Bob Graham is a special investigator for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. He headed a year-long investigation of the People's Temple's activities here. Also joining us is Phil Bronstein and Rollin Post. I suppose we ought to start at the beginning, and maybe that would be with you, Phil. You as Assemblyman Brown said, it was the first serious word that something was wrong at People's Temple came from your article. Why do you think it had taken that long if all of these things had been going on?
Well, in part because the Reverend Jones convinced members of the temple, both inside and those who had left, that it would be dangerous for them to talk to the press. The very example the Assemblyman mentioned, the Fresno Four, where they had an awards dinner. He, in point of fact, told members of the temple that he, through that procedure, had bought off the press. He had earlier, in 1974, 1973, made a series of contributions for the protection of the First Amendment. They were small change stuff, and it was totally unserious. I mean, there was never any attempt. None of the papers thought it was a bribe, but Jones told his members that it was. So they were fearful of the press. He also told them that he had information on all the public officials in the city of New York, the city of San Francisco rather, and that he was going to use that information, and that for that reason these public officials were in his pocket. None of this was true.
One question I have, Phil. Do you think that public officials who sought support and got support from the Reverend Jones should have known more about him than they did? You heard Willie's explanation and Mayor Moscone's earlier, that, you know, from what they knew, there was no reason to be suspicious of this man, and the man that they knew was not the man, apparently, who was down in Guyana. Now, should they have had information?
Well, I don't think that you can say that they should. There were some things that they could have asked. This man traveled around with bodyguards, 10 or 12 of them sometimes, and that was certainly suspicious. A man who preaches integration in the city of San Francisco doesn't need 12 bodyguards. That this is not a racist city. The temple had its doors regularly locked, and when people came to services, they were often searched. That was certainly very strange. And all these charges that the Reverend had made for several years about being under a constant harassment campaign by the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party. My experience of the year that I lived here in San Francisco was that neither one of those organizations had any strong membership in the city, or in fact, I never even heard it mentioned.
Well, Phil, let's hear from Dr. Goodlett, who was a friend of Reverend Jones, and even yesterday seemed to have had trouble believing what was coming over the news.
Well, the first thing I can tell you that one of the strange things about why the articles would appear in New West rather than the daily newspapers were rather strange to me. And I can tell you that most of the racial minorities in this country have little regard for New West. And what they did to Diamond has reinforced our opinion. Now, I do know that when they first moved to this community, that there were no guards in abeyance at that time. But after they were burnt out, several $100,000 worth of damage done to the building, they had to rebuild it alone. They had no insurance on it. It was necessary to have guards there to protect the man. And don't forget the death of Malcolm X and others. And don't you believe this is a city without racism. This is one of the most racist cities in America because of the flair. And it's a city that practices sexism and classism and racism.
Dr. Goodlett, I heard you discussing this afternoon, some people with the events that went on in the last few days in Guyana. And you seem to feel that, although it was unfortunate that people were dead, that there was some justification for it.
Well, you see, from my point of view, the good works of a man, as well as his rascality, they're not interred with his bones. And I, as a psychologist, I've been a psychologist for 40 years, I understand some of the psychodynamics of cultism. And I also understand the psychodynamics will lead persons to gravitate toward religious organizations of this sort. And I'm not particularly concerned about the inner workings of the organization.
But I mean, how do you feel about the people who in fact took their lives as a result of being a part of that cult?
Well, this explained. I can explain very easily how the people went down and massacred Ryan, because Ryan was warned not to come at a time of his choosing, that they would receive him. And they didn't like the people who he was in company with, that he was being accompanied by about 20 people who were known enemies of the temple. And I, for one, advised him not to invite him in. And if they'd followed my advice, everybody would be alive today, because I would have him cooling his heel there for many months. And I also feel that the mass suicides can be explained on the fact that these were people, and most of them were blacks. It's very difficult to get that many black people to leave home, hearth, and loved ones, even with poverty abounding, and go 6,000 or 7,000 miles from home. But they were convinced that racism and sexism and classism in this country would never be destroyed. They wanted to have a new life, a new beginning.
But how do you explain the hostility of the neighbors now, who are black and who are working class, towards the temple? And many relatives showed up who had been hostile all along. They said, my mother or my brother had been down there, had been giving money to Reverend Jones, and I tried to tell him not to do it.
Well, you see, I'm not a fanatic as far as religion is concerned, but people have been giving money to the Catholic Church, property and that, for years. The Greek Orthodox Church and many of the other religions have been taking money. And I don't worry about these matters. This is a problem that they have to deal with. I have to deal with a person as a person who has a need, and I can respond to it. I first respond to it as a physician. And second, he became my friend. And third, he was a man who really attempted to practice the dogmas of Christianity, as far as I saw it. Yeah, he had problems. And as a local newspaper publisher, many of the complaints that eventually gravitated to the New West magazine came to me. And I said to these people, I said, listen, I don't have anything to do with the internal organization, but if he's guilty of malfeasance, take it to the district attorney's office and let him be brought to a court of law.
Let's hear from one temple member and then from the district attorney's offices about what's happening. Mr. Mills, you were in that church. You've heard some of the things that we've discussed just as outsiders. Tell us what your views are.
Well, I think any politician, after reading the New West article and after hearing the other subsequent articles that came out in the Examiner, to continue to unquestionably be involved with Jim Jones is blind. I think you, Mr. Goodlett, still haven't reconciled the fact that Jim Jones cared nothing for you but what he could get out of you. Jim Jones used every politician. He had no respect for anyone. I took a photograph of him hugging, I can't remember the man's name, a black associate mayor. Jim Jones had his finger up like this. Jim Jones, my loyalty, I showed Jim Jones this picture. It was a big joke. He cares for no one but Jim Jones. I have no hostilities towards People's Temple. I'm very concerned about the people down there that are still alive. I'm sorry that we were unable to free these people from the prison camp before this happened. If we could have had people like you, like all the other politicians, that really listened to the first light that maybe something was wrong and started examining, maybe we could have stopped this before it happened. Even at the time of the Holocaust actually was happening. We had warned the United States government ahead of time that this might happen. He threatened it many times. Please get somebody down there. And after it happened, how long did it take to get somebody down there? These bodies laying there suffering.
What attracted you?
Just one moment. We really need to hear from the district attorney's office as to what's happened with the investigation.
I wouldn't condemn anybody for being caught up in Jim Jones. I mean, he was a very shrewd man. He appealed to people on the civil rights, on the injustices in the society.
Mr. Mills, may we hear from Mr. Graham? What did the district attorney's office find out once you started to investigate?
Well, we spent about 8 weeks investigating intensively. We talked to something over 100 people, former members like Mr. Mills, and some present members who were willing to talk to us but not say very much. After about 8 weeks, we decided that we didn't have a criminal offense that we could prosecute in San Francisco. We sent some information to Mendocino County because we felt there was a possibility of prosecution up there. We sent some information down to Los Angeles County because we felt there was a possibility of prosecution down there. But here in San Francisco, we had no information. We dealt with the press. Mr. Tracy we interviewed, Marshal Kilduff. Everybody who had any information to impart was interviewed. Nobody was able to come up with evidence of a criminal offense here in San Francisco.
Do you think, Phil, Tracy, does that square with your understanding?
Well, I just had a question for the district attorney's office, and that is, why is it that when you had repeated testimony to the effect that young children were being beaten inside that temple, why is it that that was not a violation of law? Is there no laws in this city or state that protect the young children from physical abuse?
Can you name for me one parent or one child who was available to discuss with us in San Francisco?
In San Francisco, his child. She was in to talk to you.
San Francisco.
Where did the beating occur?
In San Francisco.
Well, when we interviewed his daughter, she indicated to us that the beating had taken place in Mendocino. I have the copy of the interview on that. So far as we were
may
concerned,
be mistaken.
we were told it was Mendocino. My senior investigator talked to his daughter, and she said it was Mendocino. So that's why nothing was done here. There was no other name of a parent or a child that was given to us here in San Francisco that we could interview and use as witnesses.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, as a reporter, what worried me was the fact that you kept waiting for us to give you stuff instead of going out and soliciting it. I never saw anything like that.
We did over 100 interviews on our own. We had 5 investigators who worked almost exclusively on this case for 8 weeks, and nobody likes to devote 8 weeks and come up with nothing. No, we worked very hard.
Mr. Graham, we have very brief time. I do want to ask Dr. Goodlett one question. It's going to have a brief answer. Do you think that Reverend Jones changed from the time he left here? Do you think he was a different man in Venezuela than the one up here? Or is this just
in Guyana?
No.
I mean, in Guyana, right?
No, he wasn't. He was a man who practiced his appreciation of the scriptures as seen by him, and as we discussed many times in San Francisco. And I can also say this to you, you know, no one needs any glasses for hindsight. Everybody's vision 2020. And in a situation here where former members of the community were they separated from it, you'd understand their vigorous opposition to it. But the point is this, the people who are supposed to protect innocent people from malfeasance in high places were given the assignments, and we could find nothing wrong with this man. And I'm telling you, I investigated many of these charges that occurred in the black community, and I could find nothing wrong with this man.
I'm sorry, but we are out of time, and obviously there is more that could be said. Thank you so much for watching us. We apologize for not bringing George Dusek's story. We'll bring it to you tomorrow night.